I'm Brian Tracy, and welcome to this session. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most important areas of all of human life. We call it negotiating the sale, but really all of life is a negotiation. Everything you do in life is a negotiation. You're negotiating from the time you get up in the morning to the time you go to bed at night. You negotiate from infancy. You negotiate with kisses. I have young children who say that, and they say that children's only currency is affection for their parents. So they trade their kisses and they trade their hugs and they trade their attention to their parents for attentions back and candy and love and trips and McDonald's and things like that. So from the time you're in infancy, you learn to negotiate, and much of your happiness in life is determined by how well you negotiate for the things that you want. You negotiate every hour of the day. When you get up in the morning and you go to get the bathroom, when you go to get the kitchen, when you get into your car and you drive out. In fact, you negotiate for everything in your life, including a parking stall. You negotiate to change lanes when you give signals to people. You negotiate when you say, well, why don't we go for lunch? And someone says, why don't we go to place A? And you say, why not place B? Why don't we go to place A today and place B tomorrow? And so on. The only question about negotiating that you have to ask is, are you any good at it or not? Now, for many years, I had a lot of problems with this because I felt that negotiating was the same as manipulating and wrangling and pushing and aggressively getting the things you wanted. Then I realized that negotiating is a skill, very much like typing. And in sales, it's almost essential that you negotiate something in a sale. What we have found is this, is that people don't feel that they've really gotten the best deal. They don't feel comfortable about going ahead unless they feel that they have somehow influenced the outcome. Nobody likes to feel that they're a passive recipient of a sales message. So therefore, allowing people to negotiate. Perfect example, remember Betty Crocker once came out with cakes that were all mixed. All you had to do was add water, and they sold very poorly. Then they realized that people wanted to have something to do with the process. They didn't want to just put water in with cake mix and bake it. So they said you had to put an egg in with it to mix it with water in order to bake a cake, and they sold off the charts and have been selling ever since. People like to be involved. Now this brings us to sales negotiation. Now sales negotiation is something that all salespeople hate, that most customers hate it as well. Customers hate it because customers are terrified to leave anything on the table, and salespeople are terrified to have their deal cut to pieces, their commissions negatively influenced, their boss to be upset, or even for the deal to go sideways because they can't negotiate. So let's start off with the whole purpose of negotiation. In professional negotiation, as opposed to buying things in the flea market or in the bazaar where you care only about the lowest price, the purpose of negotiating, as defined by Gerald Nuremberg and by others, is to reach an agreement such that all parties are satisfied, and satisfied to the point that they are willing to fulfill their commitments and go through with what was arranged. There's nothing wrong with, nothing worse than negotiating a settlement and having people so unhappy with the settlement that they won't carry their part. And finally, they're willing to negotiate again with the same party in additional details, on additional deals. What we find, by the way, is the most successful business people, most successful salespeople for that matter, are those who have been selling and negotiating for years with the same people. Some of the very most profitable relationships in your life will involve you going back and forth, negotiating, compromising, negotiating, finding satisfactory settlements, changing the settlements, and so on throughout your business life. So it behooves you to become very good at it. Which brings us to the first rule of negotiating, which seems like a bit of a contradiction, but the first rule of negotiating is, number one, avoid negotiating whenever possible. Avoid negotiating whenever possible. Why? It's because if you can possibly get out of negotiating, you're much more likely to get a better deal for yourself and for your company. You're much more likely to have a deal that is satisfactory to everybody. So here's the keys to avoiding negotiating is charge fair prices. Charge fair prices and charge competitive prices so that there's nothing to negotiate. The second part of avoiding negotiating is this, is to expect resistance. Expect price resistance. You know, there's lots and lots of courses, and we'll talk about them at various times in this series, but there's lots of courses that teach people how to react when they hear the price, even if the price is reasonable. For instance, they'll say, how much is it? It's $295. People go, oh, geez, God, geez, that's... It's called the flinch. Can't you do anything better than that? Or they'll say, geez, is that the best you can do? I can get it cheaper from several other companies. You know, they will come back and they'll use it as a technique. It's something they took a course in last week, and you're one of the people they're going to try it out on. So therefore, always expect sticker shock. Always expect people to resist and to react poorly to price. You'll never find anybody who, when you give them the price, says, geez, that's a good price. Wow, I think I'll take more than one. And here's the third way to avoid negotiating. Tell them that you have no authority. Tell them, geez, I'd really like to. I really appreciate your concern, but I don't have any authority to negotiate. See, these are the prices that I'm given, and our company has shaved these prices down as low as they can possibly be, and this is the deal, and it's kind of like an all or nothing. There's nothing I can do. So when you tell them you have no authority, that kind of ends the conversation. Very often they'll buy it at that point. Now sometimes they'll try to go around you. Important point. If you're negotiating for an appliance, a car, a house, or anything else, and the person says they have no authority, ask to speak to the person who does have the authority. Tell them then, if you have no authority, I want to speak to someone who can give me an answer, and then see what happens there. But when you're selling, just deny that you have the authority and tell them that the person who does have the authority is away on vacation for 2 weeks or something like that. Okay, now here's the next point, is delay negotiating as long as possible. If you have to negotiate, delay negotiating as long as possible, and for very good reasons. Let me explain these to you. The first reason is simply this, is that early concessions have a little impact. And this is something that most salespeople don't understand. Early concessions equal low impact. What does it mean? It means that it's very hard to influence a person by giving them an early concession. They've made this mistake with salespeople. They say, look, we need the business, so we're going to give you the authority to negotiate discounts of certain amounts. But only use it as a sales tool. And you know what salespeople do? Is that salespeople say, hi, I'm Brian Tracy, I can give you 10% off. And they do this even before the person knows about the product or service, knows what it can do, knows its value, knows how it compares with competition, and so on. So here's the rule, is don't give concessions initially, even if they flinch, even if they cry, even if they wring their hands or say they can get it cheaper. Just remain strong, because they don't have much of an impact on the sale, and we'll come back to this in a second. The second point of delaying negotiating as long as possible is that discounts don't increase attractiveness. Discounts and concessions don't increase attractiveness. If the customer is not fully aware of what your product or service will do, by telling them they can get it at a special deal at a special price is not going to make it more attractive to them. Because, and here's the key, buying desire must precede concessions. Buying desire must precede concessions. If buying desire, we've found this in thousands of sales calls and in interviews with thousands of customers, that if you make concessions of any kind before the person wants the product or service, it'll actually be more harmful to you than if you don't. And the reason for this is quite obvious, is that a concession not accompanied by buying desire or preceded by buying desire has no impact. So therefore, when a person says, well, can you get it for me cheaper than that? You can always say, well, does that mean that you want it? Or how soon would you be willing to go ahead? Or how many of them are we talking about getting? In other words, before you get a concession, the person must have told you in one way or another that they actually want to own the product or service. Here's a key point, is negotiating, I'll use this, negotiating is a sales tool. It's a sales tool just like a telemagic or act on your computer, just like a time planner, just like a briefcase or a sales kit. It's a sales tool, and it is to be used later in the transaction. It's something that you keep and that you use later on when the timing is perfectly right. Remember, early concessions create an appetite for more concessions. Early concessions create an appetite. If you give concessions early in the sale, do you know what happens? Yes, what I'll tell you what happens is the first person who gives concessions is considered to be the person who will give more concessions and give the most concessions. When you give concessions early in the sale, you tell the prospect that there are more concessions available, that these are merely the opening cards. But here's an important point with regard to concessions, is if you start off giving concessions early, you're telling the customer that this price and these terms are not fixed, that there's lots left on the table, that if you accept these price and terms, you're crazy, because I've already signaled to you that you can get a much better deal if you demand it or ask for it or negotiate for it. So when you start off in selling, keep negotiating in your hip pocket, keep it in your briefcase, keep it in the car. Never bring it into the sales conversation until you get to the point where you can use it with the greatest effectiveness. And especially with regard to negotiating, never use negotiating as a substitute for salesmanship. Never use negotiating as a substitute for salesmanship. And again, when I say salesmanship, you know I mean saleswomanship as well. But many salespeople, because they have not taken the time to really understand the context of what they're selling, not to really understand the value of what they're selling, instead they collapse when they get the first resistance, and instead of focusing on building value, instead of focusing on asking questions, instead of focusing on finding out what it is that the customer really wants and needs, what their situation is, what they've done in the past, what their plans are for the future, until they start, instead of asking the customer the various factors that will help them identify the values of their product or service, what they do is when the customer resists, they immediately collapse and they start giving the customer things. The very best salespeople, by the way, almost invariably use negotiating only as a very gentle tool at the end to finalize the deal. It's only when you have a commodity product which can't be differentiated from other offerings by other companies, and you have an extremely competitive market where your competitors are willing to get the business on an uneconomic basis, it's only then that you get into very, very tight negotiating. Other than that, you avoid it as much as possible. Okay, here's some requirements that you must have before negotiating. I call these the musts. Without these requirements, or without these factors in place, refuse to negotiate, or at least don't get into a negotiation if you can possibly avoid it. And number one, it must be essential to make the sale. In other words, the person must want it, but they must make it very clear that unless you're going to negotiate or shift or come down or add something else, they're not going to buy. And sometimes customers will hold your feet to the fire and even lose a sale or a purchase of something they want unless you can sweeten the deal. And second is that you must absolutely have the authority. Don't get into negotiating if you don't have the authority. As we said earlier, if you don't have the authority, say, look, I don't have the authority. And here's the third requirement, is both parties in a negotiation can negotiate. Both parties can vary the deal, can vary the price, can vary the terms, can vary the ingredients of the deal. Be very careful. As a matter of fact, many people are very good at this, is they'll get you into negotiating. It's called the Russian form of negotiating. The Russian form of negotiating is where the one side negotiates, but they have no authority to deviate from what is on the paper. The other side is given full authority to negotiate, so the only thing that can happen is that the American side can give concessions, but the Russian side cannot give any in return. So when you negotiate with a person, make sure that they have the authority and avoid what is called the agent without authority gambit. Now, the agent without authority gambit we talked about a second ago, you can use it yourself, means the person says, well, I'd love to be able to change this, but I don't have the authority to make any alterations. Here's an example. You go into a store. Many people think when you go into a store that the posted signs are the posted prices. Remember, somebody up in the back pulled the price out of the air, wrote it on the sign, put it on the item. Your job is, especially if the product is on sale, or they have a lot of them, or the season has changed, or it's a big item that sometimes goes on sale, your job is to say, I'd like that, but not at that price. They may argue with you. They say, well, I mean, that's the price. I mean, see, the price is nothing I can do. Then you say, well, if you don't have the authority to discuss it, let me talk to somebody who does have the authority. You'll find in automobile dealerships, they'll give the salespeople the right to take the information, but not the right to negotiate the sale. They have to go to a sales manager who will then finalize the price and make the concessions. So make sure that nobody pulls agent without authority on you. And if they do, you pull agent without authority on them. You say, geez, you don't have the right to or the authority to negotiate. Geez, neither do I. So what can we do? Maybe we should get together with the people who do have the right to negotiate. Okay, what are the aims of negotiating if you're going to do it at all? In sales, the aims of negotiating are, first of all, number one, is to get the sale. Remember, we just write here, aims. It's to get the sale. If you don't need to negotiate, don't. If you don't need to give concessions, don't give concessions. Many people often get in and they'll be halfway through and they'll have the right to give concessions, they'll throw them in anyway. Remember, your job is to get the sale, but also to get the very best deal for yourself and your company. Second is to build long-term relationships. Build long-term relationships. Sometimes you will do things for the customer that you wouldn't normally do as an investment in building a long-term relationship. And the third, as we go right back to our original definition, is to satisfy both parties. A negotiation is not a good negotiation unless both parties are satisfied. And by the way, many of these principles apply to negotiating at home, negotiating with your spouse, negotiating with your friends, negotiating with your children, and so on. So, you want to get the sale, you want to build long-term relationships, you want both parties to be satisfied. And if you don't get the sale, if you don't build a long-term relationship, and if both parties aren't satisfied, then of course there's no point in negotiating, and there's no point in you giving concessions. That means, by the way, you must be satisfied as well. And that brings us to the basic styles of negotiating. There's 6. Now, these styles have been talked about in 1,000 different places, and you know about them, you've heard about them. The very first style of negotiating is familiar. It's called the win-lose. The win-lose style of negotiating is where you win and the other party loses. You get a deal where your needs are satisfied, but the other parties are not. You're happy, but the other party is unhappy. Sometimes you do this when you have the whip hand, when you have particular power, when there's things that you can do. I'll give you an example. I bought some stationery from a company once, and they sent me a bill. It was $150. When we used up the stationery, we sent them an order for a duplicate order 6 months later. They sent me a bill, but this time it was for $300, double the original price for the identical stationery. We said to them, called them up and said, this isn't right. This is not a fair price. This is not what we expected based on our previous conversation. They said, well, too bad for you. If you don't like it, go to court. So we went to court and we actually lost. We lost because we hadn't asked the price. So they won and we lost. But you know who lost? They lost because soon they went out of business, because soon nobody would do any business with them. So a win-lose situation, sometimes you win in the short term, but you end up losing in the long term. A win-lose situation is where you impose your will on a member of your family. You win, they lose, but it'll come back to haunt you. Now the second is lose-win. Now lose-win is where you lose and the other person wins. In other words, you accept an unacceptable situation in order to at least not fracture the relationship, in order to get a deal. Some companies will actually enter into business deals where they'll lose money, but they'll think that if they lose money and the other person wins, at least they'll build up a relationship that somehow will turn into business later. A lose-win relationship very seldom inures to anyone's benefit, because the next time the deal comes up, they will want the same deal. They'll want you to continue to lose. I used to have a lot of friends in the speaking industry, and I remember asking Earl Nightingale some years ago if he ever took free speaking engagements, and he said no. He said, the only thing you get for a free speaking engagement is more free speaking engagements. The only thing you get when you put yourself in a position to lose is more opportunities to lose in the future. So, number 3 in negotiating is called lose-lose. Lose-lose is where you and the other party become so emotionally involved in the negotiation that you accept a deal that is dissatisfying to either party. Remember the original definition of negotiating. It is to reach an agreement such that both parties are satisfied to the point where they're both committed to live up to their commitments in the contract, and they're willing to enter into new negotiations in the future. In lose-lose, neither party will want to deal with the other party again. Lose-lose has no advantages at all. Now the fourth, and this is where most people stop, is compromise. Compromise is where each party gets a little bit of what they want, but not all. Each party is satisfied, but not happy. Each party is kind of taken the short end of the stick. Neither one is particularly overjoyed with the result. Many of us settle for compromises because we think that that's the best thing. Now the fifth is the best of all. It's called win-win. Now win-win is where you are both satisfied and happy. You both get what you want. You both feel that you're better off as a result of negotiating. You're both happy with the negotiation and satisfied. You're both committed to making it work, and you're both willing to enter into negotiations with the other in the future. Give you an example. A couple is debating where to go on their summer vacation. And he wants to go to the mountains, she wants to go to the seashore. He wants to go to the mountains, she wants to go to the seashore. Goes back and forth and back and forth. Now, they have 2 weeks off. They can go 1 week to the mountains, 1 week to the seashore. And half the time, one of them will be dissatisfied. It's a compromise. Or they can both go to the mountains, and the person who wanted to go to the seashore will lose. Or vice versa, and the other one will lose. Or they can do something where the mountains and the seashore are close together. They could go to a place like Vancouver, British Columbia, which is one of the most attractive destinations, cities in the world, where you have the seashore in the city and you have the ocean and the mountains right behind the city 15 minutes away, so they can have both the mountains and the seashore every single day. This is a win-win solution. Now, the final alternative to negotiation is no deal. No deal is where you agree that there is no way that you can find a solution that's going to be satisfactory, and you agree not to agree. You agree to disagree, and you go your separate ways. And the rule is simply this, is that if you want your negotiating to be satisfactory, it should be win-win or no deal. It should be that you both benefit, you're both happy, or you don't deal with it at all. Now, the final point of sales negotiating, and we will talk more about negotiating in a subsequent session, but the final part of sales negotiation is preparation. Preparation in negotiation means anticipate the customer's position. It is just to anticipate, to think it through. I can tell you ways that have been helpful to me, but let me give you 3 that you can use in any negotiation prior to going in. First of all, you can use what is called the lawyer's method. Now, the lawyer's method is where lawyers, when they're going to law school, are taught to debate and argue the case from the other lawyer's point of view before they prepare their own case. So they imagine that they're representing their opponent. And they then go to court and they look for every single piece of law and precedent that they can find that they would bring into a case if they wanted to do the very best job for their opponent. Once they have looked at every single possibility and researched every possibility and spoken to other people, only then, now they're fully alert and aware of what the other lawyer is likely to do, only then do they begin to prepare their own case. This method of thinking, by the way, is a tremendous method of thinking. Always try to think in terms of what the other person wants, what the other person needs, where the other person is coming from, what the other person's emotions are and demands and constraints are, and so on. Use the lawyer's methods. The second method that you can use is called the 20-idea method. Now, the 20-idea method is where you write down every single detail and you ask a question. The question is, what do I ideally want to get out from this negotiation? And you write out 20 answers. And once you've done that, you write down everything you want, then you write down and say, what does the other want to get out? And you write down 20 answers to that. Then you go through and you look at your answers, and you look at the other person's answers, and you compare the answers, and you saw them off. And you investigate, you research, and you find different ways where if you take the two sets of answers together, you can start to draw off different things. I've done this, by the way, in very complicated negotiations and found that only a couple of issues actually stood out and that those issues could be resolved. Now, the third key to preparation in sales negotiation is research. Research means ask questions. Ask questions. Talk to someone else who has negotiated with this person. Talk to someone in your company. Talk to someone outside your company. Do everything possible to find out how this person negotiates. What do they want? What are their aims and objectives? What is their style? I've been in a negotiation situation where I called someone up and I said, look, I'm going to be in a long meeting with them discussing several issues. Can you give me some ideas? And you know what they said? They said, well, this person will come in like a lion. They will demand everything. They will be absolutely adamant, and they will act as if they are not going to compromise on anything, but it's all an act. Your job is to nod, smile, agree, and then go through every single issue one by one and offer reasonable alternatives. So I did, and the negotiation turned out well. In negotiating, let me finalize by saying this. All of life is a negotiation. All of sales is a negotiation. The only question is whether you're any good at it or not. And the only way that you get good at it is by practicing. So get out there and practice.